Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Please, if you have any problem with the quality of the sound, please let us know in the chat box. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this beautiful evening, and greetings to you from wherever you're joining us. My name is Dalia Abdullah, and I'm a Senior Director at AUC Innovation Hub, with which we are very happy to co-host today's Future Talk. And before proceeding, introducing, of course, our very distinguished guests and the topic of today, let us give you more background about AUC Innovation Hub and New Silk Road. AUC Innovation Hub, we are the heart of the AUC, and we offer the space for industry, partnerships, multidisciplinary research, and exponential learning. We offer startups, corporations, AUC faculty, students the opportunity to collaborate together on strategic research projects and co-create innovative solutions for Egypt's and the region's toughest challenges. And we're very happy to co-host today's talk with New Silk Roads, which actually offers a full range of futures thinking programs focused on collectively imagining preferred futures and producing innovative future scenarios. New Silk Road have been around for more than 10 years and has been working with a range of clients, including international organizations, multinational companies, and different enterprises. Futures talk of today are being implemented as part of GreenWorks program led by HIVOS, also unfunded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Please feel free. I highly encourage you to follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram for the talk recording, and of course, upcoming future talks and other events. And my colleagues will share with you the links in the chat box for those platforms. So please follow us for more. And as you have signed up for today's talk, it is about, or it's entitled as Towards More Than Human Mobility, the Future of Sustainable Cities in Egypt. As most of us are Egyptians, live in Egypt, we can see that there's a plethora of new cities coming around in Egypt, and the movement of circulation of living and non-living things will be shaped by rapid increases in population, urbanization, and land use. So there are a lot of questions around having new cities and how that would affect the future of these cities. To what extent there is human-centered active transport, what we can learn from the collective Egyptian memory, how we can expand our understandings of cities' impact or value beyond the material outcomes. So more and more questions where our distinguished guests will be navigating with us today through. So without further ado, let me introduce our very special two guests. We are having both Momen El-Husseiny and Noran Abdou. So let me start by Momen. Momen is an assistant professor of architecture and urban design at the American University in Cairo. He holds PhD in architecture from the University of California with a designated emphasis in global metropolitan studies and anthropology. He also registered architect in Egypt and a trained ethnographer. His scholarly work falls at the intersections of critical urban theory, massive urbanization, governmentality, modernity, and othering, politics of space, gated communities, mapping communities under threat of climate change, healthy cities, and sustainable urban mobility in new desert cities. Of course, very, very interesting combination of so many topics together, and we're very excited to know more from Momen. Also, this talk will be we have a very special moderator today and contributor, Noran Abdou, as an urban planner and interdisciplinary researcher who specializes in urban analytics. Her projects mainly focus on mapping for development, geographic citizen science, and digital participation. She's currently a senior urban planner for ACOM in Dubai, and she holds a master's degree from Stuttgart University in integrated urbanism, Noran, and sustainable design, and bachelor degree in architecture and urban design from the American University in Cairo. So we're very excited to have you both, and your experience would be very much shaping a lot of exciting discussion today. Before I give the floor to you, just allow me to clarify a few housekeeping points for our participation or participant today. Please note that this future talk will be started with a moderated presentation and discussions by Momen and Noran, and then will be followed by a moderated discussion and Q&A session from you as participants. So please feel free to put your question in the chat box. We will be collecting questions from you for our speakers throughout the talk via the chat box. As I mentioned, you don't have to wait till the end of the talk. And please feel free if you would like to share your name and affiliation. Please note finally that this webinar is being recorded, and that will be sharing the video publicly online after the talk. So without further ado, Momen and Noran, the floor is yours, please.
Hello, everyone. Good evening and good afternoon. And it's lovely to be with you. And thank you so much, Dalia. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Nada. And of course, I'm so humbled and happy to be with Noran. So today we're going to talk about towards more than human mobility in urban planning. So what is this about and how to approach it? So in June 2022, a few weeks ago, there were heavy monsoons in Pakistan that led to the submergence of almost 1/3 of Pakistan. That raises a lot of questions. What is the future of cities? How are we moving? With that kind of climate change, there are a plethora of destabilization, unsettlement, and displacements that are going on. And it involves humans, but also non-humans interactions. The climate change is a serious matter. And with that, maybe we can have a step backward to think about what is the status of cities, what is the urban condition, and how is it growing? And we can start by a simple figure ground or solid and void of looking at cities from the perspective of a bird's eye view. And here we have the same 1 kilometer area for New York, Paris, Tunis, and Atlanta. These are the same scale. And if we looked at New York, for example, we realize that there's some sort of a very iron grid, mechanical, and it reflects a worldview that was during that time, which has to do with business, land, urban economics of land and structure. If we looked at Paris, we realize that it is following the grid of l'étoile or star-like urbanism, which is about main nodes that then create multiple ways of mobility and streets. And if we looked at Atlanta, we would realize that the street blocks, it is so much as in terms of one unit that is huge, and we will see that it is infiltrated with highways and bridges. Whereas if we looked at Tunis, it's an interesting kind of assemblage, what we call sort of an interesting formation, because it tells us about history. So in the heart of Tunis, this is the historic area, which is very similar to historic Cairo and a lot of cities across the Middle East and North Africa. But then outside that kind of urban order, we would find the mechanical kind of grid that reflects the colonial time. And we will see that here in the heart of the city, the modularity and the granularity of street blocks are small, and it tells us something about walkability and about this kind of notion of intimacy, whereas it becomes more longer, bigger in New York and then in Atlanta, and it kind of developed differently in Paris. So here's a very important point, that every single city reflects a time in history and a paradigm that was controlling it. And very interestingly, Giambattista Nolli, who is an architect and geographer, developed a technology of mapping and was innovative during that time in the 18th century, where he developed an urban grid that looks into buildings and navigation, where the public buildings, you can see them, and they are drawn with their columns, whereas those that are completely solid and black, these are private buildings. So he wanted to create a hierarchy in even drawing, where the open space, it is accessible to all, and then there is a sense of accessibility by buildings into doors, but it is accessible to public, whereas the complete black ones are private. Here, the most important thing that I want to like highlight here is it's always about the human. It's always about people. And here, that kind of modality of mapping and navigation of the streets. We see here the bazaar in Isfahan, where there is the spine. It's very similar to Khan al-Khalili, where you go through and there is the wikala, and there is the mosque with a certain kind of orientation to the Qibla, and then there is the madrasa, and you will find the Bimaristan and so forth. So the public buildings and the interaction of the streets, that was the main focus. That was the main kind of understanding, because again, it is the paradigm. This is where the Khalifa would pass by the bazaar and give the blessings to all these shops and businesses. That kind of shifted a little bit massively with the Industrial Revolution and this sense of assembly line and actually the invention of cars. And here's a very important thing, is that cars or motorized vehicles are relative inventions that are no longer than 100 plus years at most. With that, unfortunately, during that time, it took over the city. And one of the most important architects and urban planners, mostly Le Corbusier, and he developed the modernist city. And with that, this was the notion of the vertical city, and that the city becomes a scenic atmosphere where you sit and relax and enjoy this sense of verticality. And the interaction with the streets would be by cars. And he has a very important quote that he says that no human being will ever see the city and experience it by walking. And that was the paradigm shift again. And we're here talking about starting from the 1920s with the Athens Charter and the rise of modernism till the 1960s. But that time, there was a certain kind of philosophy behind it, which was space-time compression. So the quality of the city was measured by how much you can travel from one point to another in the fastest way. And that paradigm became the dominant ways of thinking that steered actually how cities develop until today, unfortunately. And for that, we need sort of during that, the past century, and the past decades in particular, there were movements that tried to shake that and unsettle that understanding. So, and for them, for Corbusier's Maisonette, which is inside the vertical buildings, it was through sky gardens and interaction between the inside and the outside through that kind of terraces. In the 1970s, and because in the 1970s and 1980s and continues until the 1980s, there was, because of 1973 and the oil embargo, there happened certain kind of social movements, mobilization, particularly in Copenhagen, of course, Amsterdam, and so forth, what we know now as bike-friendly cities. But in Copenhagen, there was intense of social movements calling with protests and demonstrations, calling for reclaiming the city and a shift from mobility, urban mobility, motorized vehicles, into something we call active transport with bikes. What we are seeing here, again, what is important here is that what we celebrate here, we have to understand the long history of development, mobilization, resistance, and citizens' awareness in order to make that change, which is so much important to reflect on that, especially with the current paradigm that we are witnessing with climate change and extreme weather conditions. Today, how technology has moved along with that kind of mobility and structure, it is calling for smart cities, platform urbanism, and with the underlying assumption of origin destination, where you move from here to there. And this is the same philosophy of space-time compression that was developed in the modernist city in the 1920s. And that kind of evolution and that kind of break from that mindset, we need a revolution of thought. Today's growing cities, and this is a physical model of Shanghai, which became kind of a frame of reference for many future cities that are growing in a lot in the global south. We have now the New Cities project. There are more than 150 new cities. If we excluded China in itself, it's all about skyscrapers, mobility, in terms of human circuits of capitalism, finance, urban economics, land value, all sorts of movement. But it's again, the problem lies that everything is tamed environment, tamed nature for the sake of humans without understanding the larger picture by which our planet is living in. So for here, this is a very important to have a stand and rethink. And this is since what we're talking about is experimentation and ideas, it's very important to reflect and to be able to move forward. So what is happening is that there's a mobility from a conventional sense of origin destination. We have the radiant city, the space-time compression. We have the Copenhagen's history, technological efficacy, and smart urbanism. But today, with the climate crisis and environmental degradation, we need to push further and rethink the city in a more than human mobility to save the planet. And here it's no choice. I mean, yesterday is already to work and operate. Yesterday is already too late. So we need to take it in a serious manner. If there is still hope, we need to rethink urban development as a plethora of movement for a more than human approach. And here, well, to reflect on healthy cities or more than human, Cecily Moller talks that cities are comprised of shared and made by animals, plants, fungi, microbes, atoms, and many other living and non-living beings, technologies, and materials. And a more than human sensibility is founded upon an awareness of the fundamentally entangled fates of humans and non-humans, from the individual body to the planetary scale. We need to focus upon exploring possible resources that could serve to institutionalize such a more than human sensibility into an everyday practice of urban planning, which unfortunately until today can be described as a tightly woven modernist fabric. So here, if we looked at the case of Cairo, the case of Egypt, we have a plethora of a lot of fauna and natural resorts and natural understanding. And here, natural resorts is not touristic resorts, but it is about migration, fields, and movement that actually enrich our habitat of the city, but unfortunately are dismissed. They're completely dismissive. Plants, whether it is birds or indigenous native plants or endangered species, and of course coral reefs, which we are very fortunate about. Unfortunately, we are abusing it by the way we are urbanizing our shores. So it's important to reflect back and rethink how to theorize and how to reflect on that as a practice. So we have two systems of thinking about closed systems and open systems. And of course, talking about sustainability is not something new, but the way we approach sustainability is somehow reflected in a closed system. It is a building that or land plot that is completely subservient in it, that is efficient, that is zero net carbon, and it's completely self-contained. And the way we are looking at things are through the skin, the perimeter of buildings or land plots, or even campus kind of sites or developments in themselves. But here, when we talk about ecosystems, we're talking about open systems. We look at the ecological urbanism and the kind of the interstices between plants, plots, and the city. And in closed system, it doesn't interact or react with the environment at all. It doesn't need, except at a limited way. And the variables are self-contained and are extremely rigid in terms of time. And here I'm talking about more than 30, 50 years. Open system interacts with the environment constantly and has an infinite scope. Relevant variable keeps on interacting, genuinely flexible, regenerative, and adaptive with time. Looking into what we are facing and trying to contextualize it within the geographical location of a very particular city, which is Nuweiba. So this is the parts of from Google Earth, this map, and we find this is the delta, here is the River Nile, and here is the Khalij or Gulf of Aqaba, and here is Nuweiba in the Sinai peninsula. If we had a look, remember, this is kind of contextualizing the forces on the ground so that we don't become all theorization. So here, this is Nuweiba. We can find from landform, this is the mounts, and there are certain kind of rifts and valleys that create that land, but however, it is forced by an elevated pitch coming from the mountain. And that kind of crack, which is incredible, and unfortunately is not used, or it's not thought of as part and parcel of how we develop our urban process. Here, urban process is not just an urban foundation of a street grid. There are flash floods that happen, and this is a very famous wadi called, or valley called Wadi Watir, and it comes with huge force of water that floods into that land that we call Nuweiba. And here it's interesting that these kind of flash floods have been happening over more than 10 years, and there are people who are affected by it. And this is a degradation of the landform with the different kind of susceptibility of morphology with the Wadi Watir. And here this is where it is becoming, this is Nuweiba, and here this is the high risk area. The approach in order to develop it, which is as simple as create a dam, cut it off, so that then it becomes controllable. And here it's interesting that there's a human tendency to control things. If you don't understand things, control it, cut it off in order to contain it. That sense of approach of governmentality or exercise of power, even to nature, what it led to is that we have a very mechanical order of an urban tissue with roads, parcels of land, ports, industrial complexes, and a nature that is completely not negotiable, and you're giving its back, and when it talks, you simply cut it off. And it has to do with how we think about those kind of systems and circuits of nature. Do we want to, this is a breaking point, and we need to understand that we are witnessing a paradigm shift in an era that is infatuated with new future cities. When would we start to design through the mobility of nature? Migrating birds in the skies, marine life in valleys, rivers and seas, absorbing nature's rifts and ecosystems as part of the circulation of minerals and resources in our planet. And to give you a background, those flash floods, they have sediments that are very important for the living organisms in the water, together with the coral reef. So there is some sort of dynamic understanding into even how these dams operate. And we need to question, when will we acknowledge nature's mobility and its dynamic fluidity? Isn't it time to break the cycle of cities' evolution and move beyond building just roads and human-centric cities to incorporate open circuit ecosystems? And this is kind of food for thought for us to develop our discussion. Thank you.
For a very relevant presentation, and I would say relevant in terms of how you brought recent examples from around the globe, and also how you brought relevance in terms of context. Thank you, Dalia, for the intro, and thank you to the audience, the diverse audience. I'd like to remind you again that we'd really love to hear from you. So if you have any questions, please start typing them in the chat, and our team will start compiling them. Having said that, I'd like to start by asking you, Momen, a question that probably I expect many of the audience would be thinking about. So the title of our talk today is more than human mobility. And I believe many of us would be thinking of mobility as the movement of people, goods, services from one geographic location to another. What I would really like to touch is if we could elaborate more on how you view mobility in a non-traditional sense, in a more than human approach.
Yeah, thank you so much, Noran, for the question. To approach that idea, we need to realize that how planet operates, and what we call now the Anthropocene, is that there is certain kind of intensive industrialization that is happening, and usually, and maybe that needs to have a point in time, 1973, with the oil embargo, with the oil crisis, that most of the so-called first world decided to relocate their industries and factories into the developing world, or what we call global south. So there is an intense kind of concentrations of carbon footprint that is happening in the global south. The mobility that is happening on the planet scale is that what we are seeing is a crisis because of something. It is leading to another fire or devastation elsewhere. So it's not necessarily that because of things are moving fast in new cities in China, then we will witness that the damage on the planetary scale in China. No, we can find it in the Amazon in Brazil. And that kind of mobility of crises would make us really realize that it's not that we are in a safe zone and we're away from everything and it's them damaging things. No, we're all implicated in that. And with that, we need to realize that not having, and one of the signs that may trigger alert and risk is not to have planets or plants or indigenous nature with us in our cities and in our urbanization and in the way we even expand further and beyond. So having that kind of close-minded approach to us alone and no one else in the planet, or even in our cities, which is then it becomes problematic. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you for elaborating what we mean further by more than human planning, or going beyond the human-centered design. If I take this further and just look at our Egyptian cities at the moment, I think it's safe to say that the status quo is not even human-centered. So cities are not built for the vulnerable groups, for instance. If you look at the elderly, the disabled, the physically impaired, and I'm not generalizing cities in general, I'm speaking about our Egyptian cities. Even beyond vulnerable groups, if we talk about women and children, if I were to change the urban planner hat and just put hat and speaking as an Egyptian mother of young children, I experience challenges moving and mobilizing in Cairo. And I'm a healthy young adult. So imagine if the layers of vulnerability add up. And I'm sure a lot of the audience would relate. If you have an elderly member or someone with disability, you'd face the challenges of moving around the city firsthand. So I think the questions to us as advocates for a different type of planning is how to advocate for a more than human planning when our cities are not even human-centered to start with. How do we imagine implementing and phasing the big ideas that we talked about?
If I can add something to what you just mentioned, Noran, which is important actually, is that we are very unfortunate is that the modernist city is a male-oriented idea. It's and that's why that we are repeating the new cities in the same way. It's completely male dogmatic, and I think that is where we need to change the discourse. Is that we need to think about feminist city, and there's there's an interesting work of Leslie Kern that pushing the boundaries a little bit. It needs more from also the global south. I'm part of the African network of cities that is based in the University of Cambridge, and with all African groups coming from African cities, and we are trying to advocate for public spaces that are focused on what you just mentioned, that is not just about males. And here, when we think about the modernist city or the feminist city, it's not just about females, it's also about male vulnerability. And the underlying concept is about caring and reparative urbanism. Is about being able just to move in curbs, sidewalks, even the design of parks, and the idea of having stalls and bathrooms, public bathrooms, a lot of things that are very important, that kind of sense of solidarity, that of sense of caring that we need to reflect on. Because even when you look at Cairo, Cairo is unfortunately top 10 stressful city, top 10 in sexual harassment, and that in itself is striking and alarming. And we need to think thoroughly into having a feminist city pushing forward, because part of the feminist city is actually incorporating the other, including more than humans.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of advocacy work that needs to happen. And speaking of that, because we're talking about before, and part of the future talks, we talked about green transitioning. So this is one of the points I also wanted to bring for discussion. When we talk about green transition, it's very optimistic, and again, we can talk about beyond human interaction and a lot of that, but the risk comes at least for the case of green transitioning, for instance. Are we actually green transitioning, or are we greenwashing? And to define the term briefly, if someone's not familiar with the word, so greenwashing is mainly when you're trying to convey like a false message about a product or an intervention. This is environmentally friendly, this is sustainable, and you sell it as such, and in reality it's not. In some parts of the world, in the Far East, we've seen it to the extent that governments were actually spray painting a concrete in green to make it look like grass. So this is literally greenwashing. But of course, it extends beyond that. It's not like how do we measure and assess our decisions? So the question actually I wanted to share with the audience and share with you also is what kind of methods and tools do we follow to be able to ensure a green city transition for our future cities? That's also would necessitate more than a human approach. And I think this is something that requires cross-sector collaboration. So it's not just, it needs a collaboration between private sector, public and civil. And I think it comes in two simple steps. Step one is following an evidence-based approach. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There are so many countries who've been in the same place where we are now that we can learn from the recent examples. It can be contextual. We can learn from other countries, from best practices, from our collective memory. And this is something I'd like to expand on more. I have a pop-up, 1 second. And the other thing is moving forward is to continue actually on the monitoring and evaluation of every intervention that we do. If you'd like to add something, Momen, please go ahead on this point.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Noran. I mean, the problem, as you said, I mean, the transition, I mean, we don't have a choice, right? And unfortunately, what is happening is more of checklists in order, so it's kind of green aestheticization even. And in order to have serious transformation, and we need actually a revolution of thought in urban planning practices, in architectural offices, in the way of research, in the way of availability of data. And this is a key thing, because it is the hard road actually to create something that is different, and we need to turn the clock backward to 1923. So it's almost 100 years ago, when we need to think about beyond cars, vehicles, and assembly lines. But also there's it's a political also thing, because there are a huge monopoly of car-based industry and finance and economics. So the easy way is to think, oh, we're gonna transform this into a checklist with the reduced kind of carbon or reduced kind of industry. I think we're in a time that we cannot really afford that, and we need to have drastic measures. And also that needs some kind of support. And here I'm going to reflect on academia into supporting science and research that is hard, that is about doing things in the mud and working on the ground. It's, of course, it might be a kind of a waste of time or lag of time in order to reach results, but actually it's an advancement into finding ways to develop how we plan, how we develop and move in our cities. So yeah, I think it's important to going back to the collective memory, that the collective memory is actually not just about cars. I mean, early in the 1940s, the movement of bikes was happened in the University of Asyut, I think in the 1940s or 1950s. So I think also that kind of decentering Cairo, decentering the capital, and rethinking about how we can distribute of our efforts and expand into that kind of collective imagination.
Thank you, Momen. And yes, I'd actually like to expand on this point, because I think moving to the future, one must look into the past as well and evaluate. So if we look at our Egyptian collective memory, if I call it this way, then I think there's so much of what we call in Western world sustainability practices was already happening by default. For example, we've all seen our grandmother or great-grandmother recycle, reuse so many of the household items. Many of us can remember houses being biodiverse, and this is again concept that you learn in a study abroad or something, but this is something that was happening in our communities. Cohabitation in terms of meaning and the meaning of co-living with animals and birds, and it's not just in the rural areas. In the city itself, we can see traces of that still in Cairo, where we see bird houses on top of buildings, the Brag al-Hamam, the wooden ones. It's part of the identity of parts of Cairo. Feeding birds, feeding street animals, just the individual behaviors. When we go to if you go to somewhere, for instance, a sustainability grocery store somewhere that's become probably super fancy and very expensive, and at the end you refill your own bottles, but this is something that we bring from our own, that we should bring from our memory as Egyptians. Unfortunately, what happens with the globalization is that we import a lot of ideas, and then we try to contextualize it, and then it doesn't work. And in the process, we end up creating failures in terms of time and effort wasted, effort and cost as well. So I'm not putting the blame. I'm not trying to put the blame of the global climate crisis that we are in now on the individual. I know this is a controversial debate, because a lot of guilt tripping is happening on the individual level, when in fact, if we actually look at evidence, the mega cities and the mega companies and the carbon heavy global economies and the private sector is primarily responsible for many of that. However, on the individual level, I think this is something that I'd like to focus on towards the end of this moderated discussion, because I think there's a lot of potential in changing our consuming habits, our building habits, the daily lifestyle. It impacts the city, and the city impacts it. It's a two-way street. We shape our cities in the same way that's shaping us. So I'm not trying to romanticize the past, but I would like this to be a call for all of us to think of what can we bring from our own collective Egyptian memory we would like to bring to the future. Few ideas would be around, like I mentioned, the consuming habits, the building materials, even the ways we shape our cities. A very simple example is just bringing shade into the city. How do we build the city? What's the urban form? How do we bring flora and fauna back into the place? We see floods every year in Tajamma and in other parts in Alexandria, because a lot of surfaces have become permeable. This is not how we used to build our cities. So there is a lot to learn from the past that we can bring into the future, and a lot to learn on the horizontal level from our peers globally. I think we can move to the Q&A part. Unless, Momen, if you'd like to add something first, please go ahead. And let me look at the questions while you add your insights.
I totally agree with you, Noran. I'm looking. Yeah, we have interesting questions in the Q&A.
Okay, so one of the questions is actually to you. It's asking, are there recent examples of more than human cities that you can share with us, Dr. Momen?
There is a transformation in urban design practice that is happening by looking at cities as in countries as Vietnam or Indonesia, because of the climatic catastrophe that is happening. And the shift, I mean, this is where I hope we don't reach that level. I mean, that we don't transform unless there is a catastrophic situation, which actually we are in it anyways. That they think about the urban form as a way of developing several scenarios. So the climate change is developing set of scenarios that we are going to be witnessing, whether it is 1 degree Celsius, I mean, global warming, or 2 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Celsius, which will be already catastrophic. I think we're almost now even close to the 2 degrees Celsius if we have not yet passed through it. So they're looking at what may happen, whether in inundation, whether in some sort of extreme floods. So how would we create land uses in the first floor, in the ground floor, in the first floor and second floor, and ways of resilience? Of course, here the notion, I mean, the abstraction of things into just a matter of saving a building or saving a city is one way, but also there is a way of adaptation that may incorporate systems of food security, especially, and we began to feel it actually with the war on Ukraine, how it affected the global market. But then we realized, okay, this is an important thing to consider in our urbanism. But these things are developed through patches, and I think it add-ons according as a response. And I think we need to think deeply into taking that not as an afterthought, but actually as a way of important constants that then we think through them and with them into the circuits, whether it is about water circulation, whether it is about actually understanding rainfalls and so forth. These kind of things pushes us to really work in interdisciplinary teams. That urbanists need to join forces with geologists, need to join forces with marine researchers, and in order to really think about what is urban form beyond just a matter of cities and cars mobility. And in that regard, actually, we needed to change academia in a sense that it becomes, even the courses becomes intertwined with interdisciplinarity, and even in practice, it becomes part of interdisciplinarity, rather than just having a contour for the sake of views or just in an aesthetic sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The second question is actually saying the presentation analyzed the relationship between urban design and the existing paradigms of the time. Can cities contribute to a paradigm shift, or is a paradigm shift necessary for planners and builders to imagine new types of urban planning?
Sorry. I mean, it's an interesting thing because there's a theory for Thomas Kuhn, whether it is a matter of top-down or bottom-up, and we have seen both sorts of things, whether through a case of an invention or a paradigm worldview, and somebody talked about it in economics. I mean, not in the economic world, economic order, of course, Immanuel Wallerstein, or whether it becomes, no, there is some kind of a crisis that then creates a social movement. What is interesting here, regardless of top-down or bottom-up, that there is a critical mass, and there is a political will in order to change and transform, and that needs courage, but also support with all kind of instruments to make it happen, and it needs that kind of mindset. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And if I add something, I just add that there is participation part of the urban governance. We'd get there faster because with participatory tools, you'd be able to actually understand what people are, what works and what doesn't, quicker and faster. It's more hassle in terms of governance, but it gives this channel for two-way communication. Dr. Momen mentioned that mobility in modern cities is based on space-time comparison. What do both of you think of recent calls for a 15-minute city, or cities where you can access all your basic needs within 15 minutes for walking by more and more mayors? Okay. So for this, I think, at least for this one, it relates to our collective memory part. This is how it used to be, being able to go quickly from one place to another. We can give it a fancy name and say mixed use and diverse and activating the urban fabric, and we can call it so many things. But in reality, it's just, if you look at how our neighborhoods used to look like, it's the opposite of the suburbs. It's the opposite of where we're heading. And Dr. Momen, please feel free to add.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. I mean, this is a term that was recycled recently, actually. I mean, if we looked at, it's recycled. I mean, by a think tank in the University of Sorbonne, but it's not new. I mean, it is calling, it's pushing the agenda further, and I think it's important, and it goes within that notion of placemaking and correlations. However, it has its own historic genealogy that actually goes to our medieval cities and historic cities, where it is about round the corner to understand and map mentally, cognitive mapping. Where is the bakery? Where is the shop around the corner? Where is the barber? Where is the things that happen in the everyday and the mundane activities that happen within the spine and within a walking distance? And that kind of walking distance have been the parameter and the variable upon which you decide to stay in a neighborhood, because this is the childhood neighborhood that you correlate to it. Of course, within the development of urban theories, there have been called by Leon Cryer, the Cryer brothers, that talked about also during that time about the quartier, which is also it was 10 minutes walking distance, and of course now it's the 15-minute cities. I think it's interesting and important. I think there's a certain kind of agenda to think about the sense of the suburban within the 15 minutes, and then or long distance if you want to expand and have that kind of shared mixed mobility.
I wanted to ask the team actually how much time do we have for more questions? And I think by now we should maybe take the last question. Would you like to pick one of the questions? One of the last three?
You wanna go ahead, Noran? Yeah.
I'm getting the message that there is no more time actually for questions. So.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I think we should move to the recommendations. So the team has asked us to pick 3 recommendations that have to do with the future. It could be anything. So I'm just going to start sharing some of the recommendations, and I hope it also answers a few of the questions pending. So one thing I want you guys to look at is something that happened 2 days ago. It's called Parking Day. So Parking Day is mainly something and like a global initiative that happens every year, 3rd Friday of September. And basically it's a group of people go and take one parking slot and imagine what could it be like. It's an initiative to try to imagine how can we take the city space, the vehicular spaces, or like the car parking spaces back to the people. So some people would make it into a daycare, or like I don't know, a chillaxing lounge for like. Just look up the website, and I think Katie will share the links in the chat. There's so many ideas. Learning about this, one of the things I always think about is how would this look like in Egypt? Do we have this? And we actually do have this to a big extent. We have a lot of people, a lot of street sellers in the street reclaiming the space. So we should be proud of the kind of practices we have. Yes, it should be regulated, it should be in certain areas, but this idea of being an activist as a citizen and reclaiming your own space is something that we do have. It would be also funny to imagine what would SIs do in what would be the reaction of SIs if you just decide, okay, I'm taking this parking slot for myself for today. The other thing I wanted to share is HOT maps, hot maps, and it's called Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. So basically, it's a crowdsourcing tool for anyone around the world. You can go in and help situations in crisis. They have a structured way of doing that in order to ensure quality of the data collected. But basically, if let's say a certain spot in the Far East got hit by a hurricane or any sort of climate related crisis, project manager would put on the call on the website, and then volunteers from around the world would go in, check the Google Maps, and check where the impact is, and start, if I were to call it, giving voice to these people, putting where they are. And in a way, this facilitates the communication between humanitarian aid agencies and the people on the ground. This is post-climate, but it can also help for pre-crisis, just putting people on the grid, because sometimes you can see on Google Earth that there are roads, there are cities, there are people, but they're not on the map. So just putting these people on the map gives them a chance to actually be reached and connected to a lot of aid and support. The last one, because the team told me I can recommend anything, so I wanted to recommend watching The Simpsons. I know there is a lot of like conspiracy, like, oh, this came up in The Simpsons 2 years ago and so on. Like conspiracy aside, I think it's a fun show that also makes you think about many of the things we take for granted in our days. Thank you.
I think most of us will love Simpsons, and actually the more future reveals itself, the more we believe that these people knew something that we all didn't know for some reason. So I believe that, I don't know, that they have an access to the future somehow.
It's the chicken or the egg.
Yes, exactly. Amazing. Thank you so much, Momen and Noran, for such amazing and super interesting discussions. A lot of food of thoughts, actually, and also thanks the audience for really interesting discussions and questions that opened really interesting thoughts. And I will end up with your statement, as you said, Noran, that we shape cities as much as cities shape us, and that's very true. And it's exciting times, and yeah, let's see how also the future would hold for this. So thank you so much, Momen. Thank you so much, Noran. And thanks the audience and participants for being engaged in interesting questions. Please follow us for further talks. And as we said, this talk is recorded and would be shared as well, the link for it. And you can also reach out to our amazing speakers, Momen and Noran, for further questions. Thank you so much, and wish you all a lovely night. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you so much. Bye.